So we've heard some fantastic individual perspectives on all different aspects of the web, accessibility, media, beauty, the power of the web, the power of technology underlying the web. And now we'll have a bit of a change in pace. Next, we're going to have a panel discussion about the future of the web and how it's run. The moderator for the panel is Rainie, who is the director of the Pew Research Center's Internet and American Life project, certainly a great student of the impact of the web. And his panelists are Fadi Chehadé, President and CEO of ICANN, Jun Murai, Dean and Professor of the Faculty of Environment and Information Studies at Keio University, and Darren Walker, President of the Ford Foundation. Let me hand it over to Lee.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Sir Tim, for everything that you've given us and built for us. One of the great delights of being an internet researcher is you get to talk to happy people. We've done work inspired by the 25th anniversary of the web itself to ask Americans, in particular, about what the web has meant in their lives. 90% say it has been a plus and an advantage and an improvement in their lives. 76% say it's been a plus and an improvement in their societies. And my guess is if we polled people around the globe, those numbers would come out pretty much the same. What we see in some of the global research we do is that there's almost a one-to-one correlation between people who are coming online, for instance, in the Arab and North African world and sub-Saharan Africa. They immediately come online and they immediately become social. That's a vote of confidence with their technological use, that they are enjoying what they want, they appreciate the diversity of sources of information they get, they appreciate the ability to participate in new ways, and they just like the darn thing. They want it to continue working. And so my first question here is to think about how the thing that works in so many good ways for so many people can stay that way. And I would ask each of the panelists now to talk about this moment of transition, this moment of challenge in many respects for the internet and for the web. How should it be governed? Who should do what? What should be distributed? What should be centralized? Maybe I'll start with the guy who's in the midst of all of those battles now, Fadi.
Thank you. And happy birthday to the web, and thank you, Tim, for everything you've done for this. The governance systems of the 21st century are very, very challenged by what you've built. And the more they're challenged, the more they're going to try to control it. Let me sum up everything that's happening in the political sphere with a comment from a vice president of a pretty large country in Latin America. Fadi, the web is powerful. We, governments, like power. We're going to control it. It's a matter of time. Unquote. So when you hear this very straight talk, which you appreciate because it's at least straight talk, you realize that if we do not help these governments understand the power of the individual and the distributed nature of how the internet should be governed, we will have a problem sooner or later. They're all getting involved now. They're all trying to figure out how to participate. And I think it's up to us. If we simply say no, that vice president may turn out to be what will happen. If we find ways for them to participate in a way that allows us to keep the values of the web, the Magna Carta, Tim, is helping us all put together. And I hope we do. This is a great call to action. I think we will be able to come out of this with a web the way we all want it. But the time is now. Let me give you one date I ask you to please remember. The General Assembly of the United Nations meets sometime between September and October every year. Next year, in 2015, the General Assembly is focused on the issue of the information society. It'll be 10 years since the WSIS. They will decide things such as, do we keep the multi-stakeholder internet governance forum, or is it time to scrap it because it failed? Is this multi-stakeholder thing really possible, or is it time for governments to step in? These are the big questions they'll be asking next year. That's not a long time. Most of their thoughts will be shaped by June of 2015. That leaves us with a few months. Have we been still? I'd say no. We've been very active and a lot is going on. But I want to make sure that today, with this great body of people here who cares, I would say, deeply, deeply about how this great medium remains a source of human solidarity. I come from a small minority in Egypt, and I appreciate deeply what the web has done to bring our people to the world and to bring the world to our people. The web is really the most powerful source of human solidarity. Also economic progress and other things, but certainly solidarity. We are now challenged, and we need to pay attention what is happening out there and find a role for governance. Because if governments do not participate, they will do it their way, and their way is drawn around the lines and the jurisdictions they're familiar with, when in fact the web is truly the most universal of all things we've made. Thank you.
Jun, do you want to?
Okay. I have two things to say. One thing is that this year is an interesting year for the people like, mostly coming from the U.S., right, in this room, and maybe from Japan, and those are internet developing countries, okay, and then, I think, we have a ratio of participants of the internet around 80–90%, right, okay, of the population. And the world population probably 35, I believe, of, the world population is participating on the internet. So the point is that we now can think about the internet assuming society, right? So this is a before internet and after internet, that we are now, many people in the world are now living on the after internet, with the assumption of the internet around in their life and the industries. And so the assuming the internet, and then we can think realistically about what the industry is going to be, what the health management going to be, and what the education is going to be in the internet developed countries, right, today. And then now, in the several years from now, then it's going to be extended to the truly global space. Therefore, then the responsibility of those who experienced the internet assuming countries need to be working toward the achievement of the global space with the after internet era. Okay, that's one thing. And the second thing is still I'm working. I've been involved in the internet domain name and other things. And when I remember the late 90s dealing with the domain name things with the World Intellectual Property Organization, representing the internet space, of course. And then it's a very interesting discussion from them that they are World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. But that's a world and international organization. But what they said to me that time was, now I'm working on a truly global space for the first time. When we are talking about intellectual property on a domain name system, right? So I'm still discussing with the government people that what's the difference between the global space and the international space, right? And then it's really still very difficult to talk with the politicians in Japan And to talk with the students in Japan, the difficulties is that what's the difference between those two? And then the internet certainly opened up and created the first human being property of the global space, rather than the international space, right? So the management of and the governance of the internet space is really the meaning that we are now responsible on the global space together with the international space, right? So those overlap is a really important thing, I believe.
Thank you, and congrats, Tim. This is great. And I am not a technologist. I'm no expert. I'm just an American citizen who happens to be president of a foundation that cares about democracy. And I find myself in conversations like this toggling between a utopian and dystopian world. And it's so true what you say, Fadi. The idea, as the commissioner said, is that we are creating a virtual global commons. And what we know about our real commons, our real public commons, is that it is a contested space, certainly in this country. And what we know most certainly is I think the contestation of consumerism and citizenry is playing itself out in very profound ways on the internet. And my question is about the mobilization of people for democracy, not for buying things. And of course, we need consumerism, but we need democracy and participation. And how are we thinking about mobilizing people to engage in the conversations at the United Nations next year? These are the questions that we think about. Where is the infrastructure of civil society and people who care about democracy, human rights, civil rights in this conversation? And so that's what we are committed to doing. With my colleague Jenny Toomey here, we think about the kinds of capacity that need to be built, the kinds of organizations that need resources to ensure that the vision for a free and open democracy is actually realized.
Some of the Pew evidence for this global culture that you've referred to comes in a question that we asked, inspired by Vint. A while ago, we asked in about 30 countries about censorship, what should be done about the internet. And there was only one country in which the majority of citizens opposed any kind of censorship on the internet. It was Pakistan. And the countries that lined up their citizen populations in favor of the most open, the least censored internet included Venezuela. 89% of citizens wanted an open internet. Lebanon, Chile, Egypt, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, Bolivia, Malaysia. Those countries had more than 75% of their citizens opposing any effort by their own countries to get in the way of what they wanted in access to human beings and the content they wanted. Another thing that we found, we've done these surveys of experts with Elon University in North Carolina. Some have participated in this room, and we are very grateful for that. And we asked recently about threats to the internet, and they identified some of the things you've talked about, balkanization being at the top of their list, but they also talked about restrictions on content flows that could be enforced in many of the same ways that Jun was talking about. They talked about corporate overreach and surveillance, as well as government overreach. Today we put out a report about cyber attacks and the threat that constant connectivity poses in the way of the vulnerabilities that it has. So I wonder if you could rank order or speak to some of the threats that you see beyond the ones that you've already described and how you think this community might be able to address them.
You want me to start? I'm going to focus on one threat because we've been quite involved in understanding it, and that's the threat of fragmentation. the internet fragmentation. The internet is quite fragmented in some ways already, but increased fragmentation will clearly stop a lot of things. It will stop the flow of ideas. It will reduce the ability of economic progress for all. We did a study with the Boston Consulting Group that showed that countries that have a lot of frictions in their policies and their access have a 2.5 GDP point difference with countries that remove such frictions. The worst was Nigeria in that study, and Sweden was top. This is significant. This is more than countries spend on energy, you know. So frictions on the internet have economic impact. Frictions on the internet have impact on human solidarity and freedoms. And frictions will increase if governments, those who can impose regulations, those who can change things, are actually unable to govern the internet any other way than to impose such frictions. Frictions can also happen through two other sources, because we talked enough about governments. We should give them a break a little bit. Frictions could happen also by ISPs. There is increasing concern that ISPs who are attacked quite significantly. I met one of the largest ISPs recently who told me that in the last 18 months they quadrupled their investment and staff to deal with attacks. It's growing, and sometimes their corporate customers are starting to tell them, why don't you create our own network? Let's get off that internet thing. So there is pressure on ISPs by large corporates to actually fragment the internet and to create different networks. So fragmentation is an issue because it takes away the magic that Vint and Tim and these folks have created. It just takes it away. And so we need to be helping reduce these frictions at the policy level, at the technical level, at the access level, at the content level, and the list is long. Boston Consulting Group in their study identified 53 areas of friction that make the internet not the internet we want. Now, I think the way you asked me, how does everyone participate in that? How do we look at these frictions, understand them, find out who's contributing to them in your community, in your country, and fight them? Identify their impact. There are many studies that show the impact of these frictions. And pick one. If you can't go after 53, pick the friction that you think you can impact and bring people together to stop it. That would be really helpful in the next period.
I completely agree with Fadi about the fragmentation. I was going to say that fragmentation is a number one threat. But in addition to that, probably the loss of transparency on the internet space, that's another threat. And probably connecting, I mean, those two are connected. But if you a lot of people, I mean, the most typical one is that, okay, internet is dangerous, therefore we kind of disconnect the internet. You know, that is a kind of hiding everything, which is losing the transparency on the entire system, so that any kind of a help about the any kind of a risk could not be generated if the system and the environment platform is not transparent.
Well, I'm no expert on friction, but what I will say is I think the biggest risk is policy and politics. And I think we don't have political apparatuses that are prepared to really address the issues in the way that they need to be addressed. And I think that's why, at the end of the day, it comes back to the people. And yes, scientists matter, and yes, capacity matters, but citizens matter most. And my question is, where are citizens in this conversation?
We're going to open up the microphones that you see in the middle of the room for audience participation soon. And while maybe people are moving to the microphones, I wanted to ask one more question. that maybe picks up on Darren's thought about misperceptions or myths or other kinds of hindrances, and have you each speak from your area of expertise. Maybe Jun can go first. Jun, people are not wise about technology, and they're not necessarily smart about what technology does for them. What is the sort of worst form of ignorance that maybe educational efforts or marketing efforts or communities like this can speak to?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. But anyway, so well, actually, yeah, a lot of things from a technical point of view. We already discussed in some of the presentations today, but who owns the data, type of things, and then who owns the data is sometimes misinterpreted, misunderstood. That a lot of sensors generating the data, and then who owns the data on this room to capture everybody, and then whose data is that, and owned by a person or owned by a building, and that kind of thing. And also one of the things I'm concerning about is that now the after internet era, then every single industries, I mean, automobile industries, medical industries, they're on the internet now. And that they are not communicating, I mean, they are not sharing the platform yet. So that's another view of, probably they are still, they are start creating the new type of silos on top of the web or top of the internet. That's another thing that I'm worrying about.
Fadi, you must be worried every day about how people misunderstand ICANN. And so maybe you could walk through what frustrates you most about people's expectations and the sort of right role you want ICANN to play moving into the future.
The biggest frustration I have is that people think that ICANN runs the internet. And it takes a lot of untangling to explain this to, President Rousseff when I first met her. We don't run the internet. ICANN is very visible because it generates quite a bit of attention with website names, and because it also generates quite a bit of revenue. So it becomes very visible. But ICANN's role is very limited. It's important and a limited role. We are responsible for the names and numbers and coordination of these to ensure that we have one web, one internet. And that's, I think, the beauty of the role we play. That's all we do. And I think that the other frustration I have, if I could tie up to something Darren said, is the fact that many people think that the only way the internet can be governed is by creating a governance model that is almost antithetical to the internet, which is a top-down model. So we've been running around the world talking about a polycentric internet governance model, a model that calls for many centers that solve different problems, kind of like the internet works, as opposed to how the international world of policy works. And that's misunderstood. There's a lot of education to be done around what is a polycentric governance model. In a way, ICANN is a node in a polycentric model. The W3C is another node. The regional internet registries are another node. ISOC is another node. We all participate in that. That's ill understood by the current governance models. Look at all my very difficult interactions with the French government right now. Because this is a government that means well and in fact has done enormous things for the internet and for the web as a country and as a government. But it's a government that is the epitome of a government that governs top-down, that is a centrist model. And it's clashing with everything we do. So this is the biggest difficulty we're facing now, and a myth that they will all get together and govern it top-down.
So Darren, you've got a call to arms here for more engagement with citizens in this process. I mean, one of the things that we see in our research is that citizens are not quite aware of how powerful their voices might be. They're not necessarily sure of the mechanisms. They're not even sure quite about the space itself. They've got their worries, even though they have their general enthusiasms. So how are you thinking about driving people towards a deeper awareness that their voice can count?
Well, it's very interesting that you say this, because this is where people like you really matter in the world I exist in. So I exist in a world of names like Kellogg and Rockefeller and Gates and these institutions who give billions of dollars away every year to further poverty reduction, to help with unemployment, to build better housing for poor communities, to work on democratic participation. And there is such weak understanding of the importance, the centrality of the work of people like you in my world. And it is that gap represents a huge missed opportunity for social transformation. And so I sit at a table with people who are pulling their hair out about how to improve high school graduation rates, and they're using methodologies that are a decade old at least. And it's because we have a population of people for whom technology is intimidating. And people like you are often intimidating. And what I want to figure out is, I think when Diane Ainsor a moment ago was talking about how you mobilize people, how you can change philanthropy through mass participation, and how you bring that together, grassroots with the significant institutional resources for this kind of work, there's huge power, but it's untapped, it's unrealized, and that's disappointing.
We'll go to the mics. Uh-oh, we're in trouble.
I can't resist an open microphone. It's Vince Cerf from Google. You mentioned things that were decades old. I want to talk centuries. The Magna Carta was 1215, 800 years ago. The Westphalian Treaty of 1648 is 460 years ago. It's about time that we re-examine some of these things. And what I think is most interesting is that we are entering a period of time now where these ideas, which were extremely important and powerful at their time, need to be re-examined. And in the particular case of the Westphalian Treaty, what that did was establish the notion of nations and boundaries and sovereignty within those boundaries.
Yep.
The internet does something to completely undermine that notion. It creates, as Jun Murai pointed out, a global environment. It's a shared space which is not it is not separated by nations or boundaries. It is simply a global communications environment. So we are in a post-Westphalian world with the advent of the internet and the World Wide Web. And so this leads to a really interesting notion, which ICANN has really forged some early and blazed trails for, and that's this multi-stakeholder notion of policymaking. The belief is that the parties who are going to be affected by policy should be involved in its making. And just roughly dividing this up, the technical community, the private sector, civil society, and governments all have a role to play in making policy. When governments are created, at least the ones that are constructive, their purpose is to protect the population from harm, to give them freedom with limits. And the limits are there to keep excessive freedom from harming every member of the population. On the other hand, you can go to an extreme and end up tying people down in such a way that they have no freedom whatsoever. They may be safe, but they may not be very happy. So here is it's not a dilemma, it's really a kind of separation between two different possible histories. One of them is cooperative engagement with governments and the other parties who could make policy, and the other is a kind of defensive crouch that we see governments taking right now. And I think, Fadi, when we talk about governments as if it's them versus us, we have to remember that it's kind of us versus us, because a lot of us are responsible for the government we live with. At least we need to remind them of that.
Yeah.
So I think our challenge right now as technologists is to understand how to facilitate the cooperative engagement that will produce a world that we want to live in, a web that we want, as opposed to facilitating a defensive crouch that prevents us from enjoying the benefits of the technology that we and all of us in this room and elsewhere have developed.
Would anyone like to add to that, respond? Maybe we'll just...
Never disagree with Vint. He is spot on about his views, and as many of you know, Vint has been leading in the last year some of the critical dialogue as to how do we move from this worldview of governing the internet to the new worldview. And he's right that we're entering a stage where the Westphalian model is being challenged in a very serious way. But he also, as he has mentored me through this, we also need to understand we're not going to remove that Westphalian model anytime soon. So how do we find a way to bring governance and governments in sync so we can move forward? And thank you, Vint, for that.
The data point to amplify Vint's assertions here is that there is palpably a youth culture around the world that feels itself not as attached to government sovereignty, much more global in its outlook, and you see it across cultures in many interesting ways. So maybe it will be generational change that drives some of the post-Westphalian world. Let's go over here.
Okay. Testing. We're going through this transition from world telecommunications to a very different world to the internet, and there are a lot of economic and other policies we have to think about. And one of them is that we're depending upon the DNS to hold the world together. It's a thread that connects everything. Yet by default, that surgical thread, it expires every year. So we've built a complete world out of surgical thread. Don't we have responsibility to sort of provide some stable foundation for the internet? This is an ICANN question. ICANN is basically defaulting to failure.
So I want to make sure I understood your question. You're saying that the DNS itself is central to keeping this thing together, but...
Okay, currently, doesn't have to be long-term, the DNS
Yeah.
is a thread that holds everything together, all the links. And by default, every link in the world fails unless you actively remember everything right.
Right.
And that also gives government a chance to deny access. It creates a point of failure. Shouldn't we be addressing that issue if we want to make this our infrastructure?
Yeah, I think we should, and I agree with you. And in fact, I remember the very first time I met Tim in London when I started at ICANN. He was sitting to my left at a table of some CEOs of technical organizations, and he told me something that I'll never forget. He said, listen, when we started this whole thing, we hope there will not be any single point of failure. We distributed everything as much as we can, except this thing. We couldn't get to do it. We couldn't distribute
But
it.
I'm saying, I understand technically point of failure. I'm saying economically we choose to exacerbate that.
Economically, we should not.
We should not require you pay, if you don't keep paying off, you can't speak.
Okay, now I get what you mean. The yearly payment, that's a change of model that we will need to have the community look at. I think that the size of the DNS sector has grown to a level that, frankly, if I can be quite direct, is alarming. We just conducted the second of auctions between warring parties who wish to get a new top-level domain. And just in the last month, the auction proceeds exceed close to $30 million on a very, very few number of strings. That concerns me. It does not, frankly, please us. In fact, we put all these monies in a separate bucket. We're not touching them until we figure out as a community what to do.
We continue this offline. It's more
Yeah,
technical.
thank
But we are concerned. I want you to know that we don't take this as just an ongoing thing. We need to look at it. And both Tim and Vint have been very critical of this, rightly so. And they're raising the community's focus on what do we do with this and do we need this.
Go back over here, and we'll do two over here because that's the order you lined up in here.
Well, after that last interchange, I'm not sure if my timing is good or bad, but I'm Tom Brackey, and I'm with the new top-level domain registry .build. And my question is directed primarily to Fadi. And Fadi, I'd like to know what you and what I can believe that this whole new community made up of hundreds of new top-level domains, whether they're individual companies like ours, whether they're geographics like .paris, .london, .nyc, or whether they're big brands like Google or Amazon or Apple. What can this new community do to impact the policy and governance concerns that you've articulated so clearly?
Well, first of all, I want to separate the issue the gentleman brought up on money from the value you all are going to potentially bring to the web. I do think there is value. I was in Paris with the mayor of Paris when he introduced .paris, and the things they're doing to enable .paris in France are actually quite impressive. I was at the Vatican a month ago, and they described to me how they'll take things they've done for 400 years in one way and move them to the new .catholic. So there will be value in these new top-level domains, and I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing. Some will fail, as they should. Others will do very well. As to the impact on governance, I think we're seeing this firsthand right now. For example, a Turkish company applied for .islam. This was not amusing to the Saudi Arabian government. A company you may know of called Amazon applied for .amazon, as they should. I mean, it's their brand and they own trademarks for it. Well, a few hundred millions of people living in Latin America did not quite like that. They thought they owned the Amazon. We had other more difficult things. For example, we are now dealing with .gay, which is causing some issues because of the applicant said they represent the whole gay community, and we have to prove that to give it to them as a community top-level domain. So it's very complicated. The governance of these things is, frankly, proving to be equal to governing a lot of the cultural fissures that exist today. And we are dealing with these one at a time, and it's not easy.
We'll go over here again.
But my question is a little bit different from others, so probably the gentleman should go ahead.
Sandy.
Sure.
Sandy.
So
Thank you.
the Westphalian and national thing, I remember having a conversation with the IT minister of Brazil. He said, no, we're not really trying to break up the internet, but we want to have a say. And so the attitude that I see among people like that is they want some national power and some national control,
Yes.
but they're okay with large commons.
Yes.
And the question is, where's the edges on the commons?
Yes.
And where are the national things? And is there something that we can come out with that is acceptable, maybe not ideal?
Yes.
And let me just suggest one thing that is a starting point, because you mentioned the United Nations. So I'm on this committee to advise the Secretary General about what to do about data. And the document, the declaration, will be released on the 6th of November. And the United Nations will vote on this, as I understand it, towards the end of the year for the Sustainable Development Goals for the next 15 years. And what that document basically says is that countries need to have interoperable data policies, and there needs to be open reporting by companies, nations, and individuals, and that goes into an open commons. There's very, very strong statements about that, because that's necessary to have sustainable development, to hear from the invisible people today. And they need to be uniform so that you can compare apples and oranges. And it seems to me that this is something that is perhaps even a higher priority among countries. And a lever for this next discussion that you talked about is that's clearly a statement about creating an open commons.
Yeah.
And they're committed, they will be committed to that. And perhaps what we can do is grow on that commons to become up with a commons that supports the vision that we'd like to see, but faces the political reality that there's going to be some local control as well. Probably not a popular position, but a political one that I think we could win. So I don't know if some of you have comments about that. But.
Anyone want to?
Well, actually, I have a question to Fadi about relating to that question over there, and Net Mundial, right, meeting being hosted by World Economic Forum, right? Okay, that's is stimulating me from a very interesting point of view. I've been involved on the World Economic Forum as well for the future of the internet. Okay, the World Economic Forum, right? Okay, if we think about the economy of the world, then it's really the global issue, right? And then when we are thinking about the individual is a global entity, I mean individual person, and on the internet is a truly global entity. Right? Internet is a truly global entity. Web is a global entity, and the economy is very close to global. And each of the nations, maybe most of the nations, would like to grow their economy. So they have a common goal, right? Okay, is that relating to the Net Mundial meeting who is discussing about the future of the internet governance to be hosted in the World Economic Forum?
Thank you, Jun. This is a complex subject. Let me try and net it to a few thoughts. I first want to say Sandy's point is very important because if we are using a new concept, it's an existing legal concept, but the concept we're focused on is called devolution. That we need to, Europeans sometimes refer to it as subsidiarity. But devolution is the model that will allow us to find a way that balances global rules, global policies, with the need for local things to also take place and to give priority to things or to solve things to the closest point where the problem is. And that's devolution in a nutshell. And that's the way we are now approaching the proposed models for polycentric internet governance. Now, I was pausing before entering Jun because some of the things Jun wants me to say, because he's in the know, are going to be publicly announced literally next week. But let me just give you a sense of where we're heading. There are two initiatives that are in the works. One of them is a top initiative of high-level players in decision-making circles of governments and business that will be in the WEF community, in the World Economic Forum community. And this is important because while things have been happening in the World Economic Forum, frankly, they've been happening on the sides of that important body of decision makers. I think in the last few months, we have arrived to an understanding with Klaus Schwab, the founder of the forum, that this will now become quite central to where the forum is heading. So starting this year in Davos, there will be some important things that will be announced shortly. And a lot of the issues we heard about today will be channeled in Davos, and because of that, we're already getting some very serious participation by Prime Minister Modi, President of China, Angela Merkel. Many leaders of governments and businesses are now responding that they want to engage next year in Davos on these issues. Now that's a good thing because many of these guys will be also deciding what happens at the General Assembly in 2015. So we'd like them engaged. We'd like them to understand our web and the web we want in a way that they're not necessarily hearing in other circles. So that's a positive thing. The second thing that needs to be done is fine. They meet and discuss models for privacy, say, or management of data. How do these go from a very good set of architectures to actual solutions? In the technical space, we know how to do that. We go to W3C, we go to ICANN, we go to the internet registries. But where do we go today to actually bring about real policies for ways we use the internet, not ways we operate the internet? It's non-existent. Now, of course, if you leave it, when we met with President Rousseff, her answer after she found out somebody was listening to her phone was, what? What did she do? She went to the UN. Where else is she going to go? She went and made a big speech at the General Assembly in 2013 saying, solve this. We should solve this as countries, as governments. Well, we met her a month later in Brasilia and we convinced her it's not going to work. That she should bring all of us into the room, engineers, academics, business people, and that together we solve it. And she agreed, and that's why we started Net Mundial with her. She invited all of us to help. So we need not just people in Davos discussing this, we also need platforms to start solving these problems. Stay tuned next week.
Yeah, well, Fadi, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leak your announcement or anything. I just wanted to discuss about the economy, global economy, and the global technology of the internet.
Hey, I heard news. I don't
But
care.
Fadi, I'm curious to know, because as we have learned from other large-scale global devolution, structural adjustment, World Bank, we've seen this story before, where there's this idea that there's going to devolve down to regions and to, at the country level, the capacity to engage.
Yes.
And where's that capacity going to come from? Who are those people? And how the power imbalance
Yes.
is such that our history has taught us that it is more likely, particularly when you're talking, I couldn't agree more. I often think of WEF, it should be this should be the World Democracy Forum, not the World Economic Forum managing this, but that doesn't exist, I guess.
But Brendan, you are spot on why we think we need both things to happen. We need the decision makers to have the dialogue. But what is different from any effort in the past to actually build structures like this is precisely what you said earlier, which is this time, and again, next week we'll talk more about this, we're actually starting all of this from the bottom up. That's never happened before. And that wasn't even possible. So I was, when the lady, I think Diana, was speaking about, she used the word crowd governance. That's where we need to go.
Yes.
We actually need to bring all of us into the decision-making of how this gets governed. So yes, major call to action. And again, stay tuned because we will need each one of us to actually do our part.
Great.
We're the last thing standing between you and Sir Tim, so we're going to take one more question, and then let's hear from both, and then we will exit stage left.
Okay, so Yosuke Funahashi, W3C team. And I have a question about, I'd like to hear about your dreams. So I deeply concerned about the threats, but this is anniversary. So would you have something you'd like to achieve towards next anniversary, maybe 5 years later or 10 years later? Specific goal you'd like to achieve on the web. I'd like to hear your dreams.
Well, 5 years.
I didn't understand very carefully.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're not quite understanding.
Unfortunately,
What things do you want to achieve on the web?
What achievements do you
In 5
want?
years.
Your dreams.
3 to 5
For
years.
the next
Okay.
thing. Yeah. Why don't we make that the organizing principle of lots of the dinner conversations? And then one more.
So I'll be real quick. He told us we don't have time for you to answer, so I'll just give a couple of thoughts. One of which I think what we should do, the people out who do this stuff, we should make sure we build the web and the internet that we want. I think what Tim is hopefully, going to talk about. We shouldn't let all these issues that the internet has always had lots of hard issues. We shouldn't let it stop us from building what we think is the right thing. And I also remain very optimistic about the future, even with the challenges, for the simple reason that my kids sort of grew up always having the internet, and so they don't, which I think is, there's a whole new generation coming, not like the people who are making the rules in government today, who sort of, what are the tubes, I think is the late senator from Alaska, that sort of view. But then when they see my grandson using an iPad, it's like there won't even be the question anymore. So what we're building here, we have, the momentum, the trend, the people, and that's really powerful. So we shouldn't lose sight of that.
What a nice final word. Thank you.